Welcome everybody to the local consumer financial protection panel. We're very excited to have you. I also want to thank NCRC for having us and giving us this opportunity to share about this work, and then also to the entire planning team to help put this together, and Aaron, our digital lead. So just a quick overview of the agenda for the panel. I'm going to start by talking through kind of the our consumer financial protection initiative, and just give an overview of what we all have been working on. And then we're going to jump right in and meet our panelists, our great panelists today, and then do a discussion about what the work they've been working on, and in particular, how they've been working with community on the ground. And then we'll end with some Q&A. So let's jump right in. So I wanted to start by just talking about why local consumer protection matters to us, and why we've been engaging in this work. And it starts with, we've all seen low-income households and communities of color have really been targets of fraudulent and predatory financial products and services. We can name all of them. And so we feel like it's an important thing that we pay attention to. The second big reason is local governments. We all know local governments have a mandate to provide services at scale to protect and enhance the lives of our residents that we're responsible for. And along with that, we find that helping residents protect their hard-earned assets is the flip side of all the work that we're doing on in terms of positive financial empowerment programming. Helping people build assets is important, so it's also important to help people protect their the assets they've earned. And then the other two are really important because local governments have a unique role that they can play as a policy implementer and a regulator. That no necessarily nonprofit can play, and so we really think that that's important for local governments to be able to utilize those powers that if they have them. And lastly, at a high level, we think this is a real great opportunity to increase access to justice for low income and marginalized communities. These communities don't have necessarily the benefit of a lawyer they can just call to help them deal with an issue. And so if there's an opportunity for local government to play a role there, we think that's super important. And you'll see that some of our city partners have really stepped up to work on that. So quickly about local consumer protection in terms of function. Our goal is to help cities build consumer protection capabilities and infrastructure. And that includes just the ability to identify problem industries and businesses, the ability to empower to regulate business activity, to promulgate legislation when they identify an issue that's of particular importance, and then also the ability to enforce and inspect and enforce regulations that have been passed. And then finally, the due process side of settling and adjudicating violations if they're assessed. And then lastly, local governments have a real power to engage in large-scale outreach and communication to really make people aware of issues that are happening across their city or county. And so these are the capabilities that we're working with all of our city partners to focus on. So we started this work in 2017 with an initial cohort of 4 cities: Denver, Salt Lake City, Austin, and Nashville. And then soon after, we also added Albuquerque, which I forgot to put in here for some reason. And then last year, we added a new cohort of cities: Detroit, St. Paul, Philadelphia, Chattanooga, and Shelby County, who began the planning process to really look at how you can build these capabilities in their locations. And excitingly, we just learned that in May, we will be launching a new cohort. We'll be putting out an RFP for cities and counties who are interested in this work. So if you are all interested in this work, please reach out to me because we'll be having a new grant, planning grant opportunity to work on this work. And at the end, this is the kind of stuff that we want. Headlines of local governments making a difference in their communities, where they're working on legislation around things like debt collection and other strategies that can make a difference in your residents' lives, and really using the local powers that that local governments can have, like to affect payday lenders and deal with price gouging and debt collectors and things like that. And so this is the external goals that we have, is for people to see that a difference can be made by your local government. And so with that, I want to now move into introducing our three great panelists. From the city of Albuquerque, we have the Consumer Financial Protection Initiative Director, Karen Myers. And from Denver, we have their Office of Financial Empowerment and Protection Director, Jay Salas. And lastly, the Office of Financial Empowerment Director of City of St. Paul, Munir Carter Ramos. And so I'm just going to stop my screen share. And I'm going to start by wanting to ask each of you to just really briefly introduce yourselves and your departments, and sort of at a very high level what you guys do, and a little bit about why you got into why you were excited about consumer protection. So I will start with Karen.
Well, hello. I don't know if it's morning or afternoon when this is going to be shown. So I am the head of the Albuquerque Consumer Financial Protection Initiative. I have a long history of working in consumer financial protection at the Attorney General's office and also at the federal level at the CFPB. And when the city of Albuquerque decided to work with CFE on setting up a municipal-based initiative, I was very interested in participating, because I think it's really important to bring those issues to the local community level. So that's why I ended up getting involved. And we've been for 2 years, and the focus has been setting up the office and moving forward and creating initiatives and developing strategies, which we'll probably talk about. And the result has been some very positive work, some good feedback from the community, and also the establishment of an office that's now going to transition from grant funded to city funded.
Great, thank you. Jay, how will you go next?
Okay. Good day. My name is Jay Salas. I'm the director of the Office of Financial Empowerment and Protection, City and County of Denver. And so we got into this work back in 2013 when we received a grant from Bloomberg and Cities for Financial Empowerment to launch the Financial Empowerment Center program. Fast forward to December of 2015, we actually pulled together the mayor announced the creation of the Office of Financial Empowerment. And so we started the work of not only the financial empowerment centers, but we also took on our Bank on Denver program and a couple other programs within the city. And then during that time, while we were working with the financial empowerment centers and with Bank On, we saw that we were getting a lot of calls, even outside of just our coaching clients, our financial coaching clients, around consumer protections, frauds, scams, things like that, that were impacting our residents. They would call us and say, hey, I was frauded out of money, or I didn't get paid my wages, or it was a, elder financial abuse, which impacted their lives. And oftentimes we would have to try to figure out ways to subsidize like their rent or their mortgage payment, so that it didn't become a bigger problem and they would become homeless. And so a few years back, we had an interesting conversation with Jonathan Mintz, and they had announced that they were going to do consumer financial protection and launch an opportunity to apply for a grant, which was just perfect timing for us. And so that's when we changed our name to the Office of Financial Empowerment and Protection. And so we've been super excited about this work, working on the policy level. We've also worked on the, of course, the outreach, developing infrastructure, like Karen had talked about, working with all of our enforcement partners, everyone from, the DA's office, our state attorney general's office, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which were very helpful when we started, and even today, and so in our auditor's office and a police department, number of other partners. And so our office really we strive to achieve economic mobility, build generational wealth, and address the financial equity gap for Denver residents and small businesses. And so, even during COVID, it really did shine the spotlight on a lot of scams that were already out there and a lot of new ones that popped up. And it really showed us what a lot of us in this line of work already knew, is that there was a huge equity gap, and we were trying to close this equity gap while there were people out there that were taking people's money illegally. So this work is very, very important, if not more important today than it even was last year.
Great, thank you, Jay. And Munir, why did St. Paul get involved in this?
Yeah, so first a little bit about the Office of Financial Empowerment. And again, Munir, Director of the Office of Financial Empowerment, City of St. Paul. So Mayor Carter, Mayor St. Paul, he has 3 pillars, of which one is economic justice. And that's sort of some of the guiding principles, of our work. So really the Office of Financial Empowerment, we're looking at how do we advance economic democracy that shares prosperity with all St. Paul residents. And what we know is sort of the financial system and the economy isn't necessarily working for everyone. And there's lots of different pieces of that. And for us, we're really looking at it from a household financial security sort of perspective. And what are the things that we could be doing? And it's not only about the household financial security, it's also about sort of the wealth and asset building that we believe that needs to happen, as well as preventing, some of the asset stripping that happens, in our communities. So some of the things that we do in the Office of Financial Empowerment, we have a college savings account program called College Bound St. Paul. We also launched the first sort of ran within the municipal government guaranteed income program called the People's Prosperity Pilot. So it's an 18-month program, $500 a month for participants enrolled in that program. Unconditional cash, use it as you will. And Mayor Carter is a co-chair of mayors for guaranteed income. So we're huge advocates both on that at the local, state, and national level to advance guaranteed income. And then other things we work on are connected to fines and fee justice reforms. So we work a lot with our police departments, city attorney, a number of other departments, working on a debt-based license suspension reform sort of at the state level right now as well. And really the reason, so sort of on this last point of why local consumer financial protection, we really get into one of our strategies is how do we prevent sort of the stripping, of income assets, from our city's residents. And like Jay said, our cohort of started, really in COVID, right? And going into that, we sort of saw, price gouging, happening sort of in the early days of COVID, and looking at what can we do at a local level to be a part of the response, right? Looking at different types of predatory practices, scams, frauds, that sort of thing. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, is we really actually began to really focus on immigrant and refugee communities and the different types of impacts, different types of predatory practices, and said, well, what does it look like for us to put in some consumer financial protection? And the key point there is financial protection. We do other consumer protection, in our office around, fair housing, renter rights, that sort of thing. But, really looking at what could we do today that's going to put our immigrant and refugee communities the best foot forward. And after Chicago in the Midwest, St. Paul is the most second densely populated, city, with refugees and immigrants. And again, we'll talk more about that. But there's no more important time than now to really embark on this work, expand this work, and for local municipalities in particular to take on this work in partnership, obviously, with our regional, state, and federal partners.
Yeah, great. No, that's a great introduction for all of you guys, and I'm want to dive right into kind of the topic that we really wanted to touch on today, which is about engaging with community on the ground and how each of you approached some of that. So Jay, I'll start with you. What was Denver's approach to kind of connecting with different community groups or interested stakeholders around Denver?
Yeah, thank you, Con. It's a really good question. I think it's one of the most important foundational pieces that we could have done moving forward, because I know early on when we had met with all of you guys at the CFE fund, and there were people from CFPB and just talking with other folks across the country that were engaging in this type of work or similar work. We were expected to be hit with a lot of obstacles, roadblocks, even territorialism, if you will, amongst different government groups or agencies and things like that. So we thought that this is a really good way to get out there and bring everybody in. And I think our mantra that I said from day one when we started engaging in community is that consumer financial protection isn't my responsibility or the Office of Financial Empowerment's responsibility. It's all of our responsibility. It is a big network of folks that really needs to work together to have collective impact, because oftentimes what we saw as we started engaging folks is that there were already, instead of kind of reinventing the wheel, there were already enforcement agencies doing maybe similar type of work, and if we just they already had infrastructure built, and if we just expanded their purview, it would allow for us to not have to build that infrastructure, but really kind of just add maybe a menu item to what they were already doing and out there. And so, to your question, I think, you had come out here early on when we received our grant from CFE, and you were part of one of the initial working groups. And so we kind of did this big casting call, if you will, and you were very helpful with actually helping us to facilitate that work. And so we reached out to, government agencies, both at all levels, not just municipal, and nonprofit partners, even just community residents, even folks that were just community helpers, that were not formally working in the community, but were those community helpers, and of course other city agencies, and talked about this work and said, well, what do we want to see? Where do we see those gaps? And right away people just started talking, and so what that led to was about 1.5 years long working groups. And so I think initially when we had asked, what are those topics that are most important to the residents and most important to what are we seeing, where are there gaps, and where are we seeing all of the, the predatory and the scams and things like that. And I think we had a list of well over 30 different topics. And so, there's no way we could address all of those at one point, at one time. So we started forming these working groups to then pare it down. And so we came up with about 6 topics that we said we're going to start with these 6 topics and probably then prioritize them. And so, through that about 1.5 year long working group, we broke out into separate working groups to work on each one of those topics. And sometimes there were regulators or enforcement folks that kind of had purview in a few of those different topic areas. And then there were also, so there were some people that were in multiple working groups, and then there were others that were unique to that specific topic. And so then we started pulling together the work and making sure that we also heard from residents. Oftentimes in those working groups, we would bring in folks that were victims or had fallen prey to predatory practices. And we would hear firsthand from them what their experiences were and oftentimes it was, we asked, well, what recourse did you have? And oftentimes there was nothing. So it really helped to inform what it is that the residents needed and what other folks, where we could fill these gaps. And then 2, it really brought us together to work as as a collective, state. And, one of the things I think that even spawned off of that is that, there's a Senate bill right now in the state of Colorado to replicate what the city of Denver has done, our office, to create an Office of Financial Empowerment and Protection statewide at the state level. And so I think that, it really helped to weave into the fabric of what we do, not only as a city, but as a state, around financial empowerment and consumer financial protection, which is super, super helpful, because now we have, everyone working together. There's no territorialism, both at the city, the state, county levels, and people actually call us to say, can we jump in and be a part of this work from not only around our state, but even across the country. So it was really helpful for us to do that outreach and continue to do that outreach.
Great. Karen, when we came to visit, you were in the midst of doing your community engagement strategy, and I really like it. Could you share a little bit about the approach that you took in terms of how you engaged the community about what this was and what we were trying to accomplish?
Well, we followed a similar model to Denver, but ours was much more streamlined. And part of that is we had fewer resources. Albuquerque is a smaller city. We had a half-time person, that's me, working on this. We didn't have other staff to necessarily jump in and be participating in this. So when we started, we were very cognizant of resource allocations and what we could do. We didn't want to promise more than we could deliver, because we wanted to create and establish a trusting relationship with the community. So we started by having a series of roundtables to talk about and hear from. It was really a listening session, I guess, to hear from the community about what were the most prevalent problems. I mean, we know that there's probably 12 or 13 different markets that you could talk about when you talk about consumer financial protection, and even broader when you think about consumer protection generally. And we identified what all those markets were, and then we asked for people to tell us what they knew about what was the biggest and most egregious problems in our community. And from that, we also then met with city stakeholders to find out what services were being provided and where they thought the gaps were. And we also met with consumer advocates and lawyers who represent consumers to determine what they saw. And we put that all together into sort of a master analysis. And then for each one, we looked at, we did, sort of which ones were most important for each of those groups. So we had a sort of a list of, in order of most problematic to least problematic, perhaps, or most repeated or evident. And from that, we then had to ask the question, well, what strategies apply? So for example, one of the issues that a lot of people raised was high cost lending, predatory lending. Well, under our state law, the state law prohibits the city or the municipality from doing anything related to the conditions or terms of those contracts, including interest rates. So we determined that that was not something that the city could take on at this point. And we went through each of the categories and asked that question: what resources would it take? What are the strategies that are available? And the strategies we considered are the ones that you put up, Con, around whether there's regulatory approaches, whether it's an outreach and education issue. And as a result of that, we started to hone in on some critical issues and topics and started to create projects, in essence, for each one. What we were going to do about tax services and tax preparers who are taking advantage of consumers in our community. What were we going to do about solar marketing problems with our community, which is a big problem? What are we going to do about scams? And for each of those, we developed a plan for how we were going to address it, and then we started implementing it. One of the two key guiding notions that I followed with that was that we needed to also bring a lens about consumer protection to the city, so that there were so many things that the city does and so many services, but they don't have the background around consumer financial protection. And so they don't link it to that. So when seniors are receiving services at a senior center, and this is pre-COVID, obviously, or had in-home healthcare providers go in to help them, or had meal delivery, the people who are doing that are providing a critical service, but they're not trained to say, oh, why did you get that phone call from the guy who's asking you to give him money? You know, and they're not trained to know what to do in response. And so we started to build a relationship across the city to train other service providers in the city to be aware of consumer financial protection issues so that they then became a resource. And that, as a result, has changed the notion of how the city provides services in a very significant way, because now they actually call me and say, well, isn't it something that maybe we should be working with you about? Because it looks like it's linked to consumer financial protection. And so we've done that. And we've also looked at what I call pathways, which is where are people getting services? Because that's where we want to, as you talk in bank on issues, integrate the notion of consumer financial protection into those existing services like seniors or community health clinics, or wherever people are going, that's their trusted relationship. How do we integrate that with a message, services, information, whatever, with consumer financial protection? And so that's what we've been doing.
That's great, Karen. And to your point, and I want to ask Munir about this, the importance of the voice of residents and communities into shaping what happens in the government, and then having the government understand, or local government services understand, all the various factors and where that are playing in, however they're reaching people, and then knowing that whether I'm just going there for meal delivery service, I might see something else. And to the fact that if I see something else, I now know where to go, that I can say, oh, by the way, this is also happening, and that you can help people in multiple ways. And so when we came out to St. Paul, and this is before you started, Munir, we started to see some of that, just like the vision of how Mayor Carter wanted the local government to intersect with the community and have it really be sort of a more seamless relationship in some sense. So I would love to hear a little bit more about how that sort of relationship kind of defined what you guys are doing on the consumer protection work.
Yeah, and before I get there, maybe I'll sort of take it in two parts. One, how do we get to focus on immigrant and refugees? And then what it actually looked to connect with those organizations and sort of folks within that community. So first, how did we get there was we were giving, our Department of Commerce, which does a lot of the consumer protection work, the Attorney General's office, we talked to the FTC, some nonprofits like the Better Business Bureau, AARP, and just ask kind of two questions. One is, which populations aren't you reaching that you wish you were? And then two, what do you see as a unique role that a local municipality, like a city, could play in consumer financial protection? And every group we actually talked to kept saying, we have really, really hard time reaching, immigrants and refugees. And we don't see a lot of reports coming from there. We hear occasionally about some fraudulent scams that, are happening, but, us at, the state and federal level in particular, we aren't at the street level to really understand or have the different types of relationships that, cities could play. So after sort of doing that first round of conversations with some nonprofits in the space and government agencies, we just said, all right, let's begin to focus actually on the population. Right. So that's when we began then to reach out to community-based organizations, Somali organizations, Latino organizations, Karen, Cambodian, Hmong organizations, and we have a lot of different immigrant refugee groups, in St. Paul. And at the time, frankly, what we had heard, and I know I've shared this with you, and John, over time, was there's a big actual fear that, particularly under the Trump administration, with public charge and with deportations and all that, there's a fear to actually begin to build some sort of government apparatus, even at the local level, that could really look at protecting immigrants and refugees. So we began to really kind of dig in with the community on well, what does that look like? What could that look like? What should be happening? What shouldn't be happening, right? And they're very intentional about us, like, all right, well, we trust you at the city level, but let's not quite bring in sort of the state and federal partners yet. So that was sort of taking the community's lead to understand, and then back channeling, saying, hey, Attorney General's office, hey, Department of Commerce, FTC, CFPB, like, we'll come back to you when, we're sort of clear on what the community, wants and needs, and that sort of thing. And we have ID'd sort of the right issues. And I think a turning point began to happen, with, the Biden administration sort of taking place, hearing more about some immigration reforms. And then folks began to actually see different kind of scams or fraud, types of messaging coming up saying, decisions have been made. And, like every time a proposal got kind of put out by either the Biden administration or Congress, we'd be hearing about all these sort of promises and come file your paperwork and, that sort of thing, to, file for different immigration statuses, bring, families from overseas, and those things aren't yet in place, right? So it really created a new window for us to engage, really over the past 4 months, on really looking at, like notario fraud, and notario fraud, is within the Latino community, but it also shows up, in the Hmong community, the Somali community, and other communities, the very parallel sort of fraudulent immigration types of services. So that's really where we began to go. And we had circumstance, we had relationship, and us just sort of taking the lead of the community to really understand what's best moving forward.
Great. So I want to follow up on the piece, and I think Karen kind of articulated a little bit about marrying the issue with the tool that you have available, and then trying to figure out how to put it into practice. So I wonder if each of you can kind of talk a little bit about an example of where you sort of put the pieces together and you develop, what the strategy. And maybe Jay, you can start with a little bit about the wage theft work that you guys are sort of focused on, which is not necessarily a traditional consumer protection, financial protection issue, but nevertheless kind of bubbled up a lot in your conversations.
Absolutely. And maybe I'll kind of talk just overall how we did it with all of the issues, and then I'll kind of focus in on that one. So as we're going through that, year to year and a half process, what we did is we took those, 6 issues that we had, and we broke it out amongst different categories, and we basically color coded them, green meaning that it was, kind of fully baked. Blue means that there was some work that needed to be done. And then yellow was that there really wasn't a whole lot going on, and that was an area to work on. But so we took the issue area and we looked at political will. Do we have the political will both at the local level, municipal level, state level, that type of thing? Then we would color code that for each issue. And then prevention, education, and outreach. So we looked at, is there prevention, education, outreach being done currently by, nonprofit, government, whomever. So we took that inventory, and we did this with these working groups. And so we looked at that, and then we said, well, is it being done? Or, and sometimes it was being done. It's just that the bandwidth wasn't broad enough to reach all of our residents, especially when we're talking about, our office, bridging that equity gap. There were, oftentimes outreach, but it wasn't done in Spanish, or, like now we're putting together our most of our work in 13 different languages. And just in our office alone, I think we speak 6 or 7 languages just with our staff capacity. And then we looked at policy review and development, looking, are there policies in place already, legislation, ordinances, things like that. And you were very helpful with this when we looked at even our state UDAP was relatively weak compared to other states across the country. So even at that first initial look at our state UDAP, it was weak in many ways. Then we looked at complaint resolution. Like what does that look like? How could we build complaint resolution? Were there complaint resolution, databases or ways that, hotlines and things that were out there to try to get people to resolution? Then we looked at monitoring. Who was actually monitoring these things? Because oftentimes we would see there would be an ordinance that was super dusty, and we would blow off the dust because no one was monitoring and enforcing it. I mean, there was great intent behind it, but without the monitoring enforcement, it was kind of for nothing. So we looked at who was monitoring, who was supposed to be enforcing those things, or who had the purview or could potentially enforce those or new ordinances or new legislation or policies that need to be put in place. So enforcement was another one. And then supportive services. I think that's where we really pride ourselves in wrapping supportive services around that. And so in the case of wage theft, we started getting a lot of calls on wage theft. And then when we started moving into COVID, even more so. And they were targeting our, immigrant and refugee populations predominantly. It was mostly in the construction industry, but we also saw it in the service industry. And they were really, and it wasn't just that I hired an employee and I didn't pay them. It was a very sophisticated scheme where some of these big contractors were setting up these LLCs they knew what the laws were, and what they would do is they'd set up these LLCs that would go out and hire folks and even bring people in, and it verged on human trafficking, labor trafficking that was taking place. They promised them, a place to live, just a number of different things, and then they would misclassify them as a contract employee, not a W-2 employee, because they knew that the law currently read our current law states employee, but employee did not encompass folks that were misclassified as a contractor. So then they wouldn't pay them, and they would string them along. And if many of these folks would try to complain about it, they would be threatened with I'll call ICE on you, we'll turn you in, things like that. And so wage theft really became, and then also with subcontractors, there was also like these big schemes happening with subcontractors where our laws only protected employees, didn't protect like subs. And so these large companies would create these middle companies, these kind of temporary LLCs, if you will. And so it wasn't traditional wage theft as we thought, because we thought, well, wage theft, that would be the CDLE, our Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. And so we partnered on them, and there was a huge gap. And then also with the Attorney General's office, when we would send folks their way, if it didn't rise to a certain number of complaints, a dollar threshold for the same bad actor, then it would go into this black hole, and they may not hear back from them for a year or at all, because it just didn't reach that threshold. So that was an area that really came up quickly for us, was wage theft, because what we saw was that folks were then coming to us to say, we need rental assistance. It was really putting pressure on our social services programs that, especially when COVID came around, we were having to do more with less, because everybody was in line for these services. And so we're saying people are stealing from these residents, not paying them, and now it's putting even more pressure. So it really forced our hand to really focus in on that area. And then when someone calls in a complaint, we're really blessed to have got a $600,000 complaint management website or system built for us free of charge by our IT department, but it wraps supportive services around them. So if they call in, they hadn't been paid for a month or 2 months or whatever it is, or their company hadn't been paid, it has an impact. They can't pay rent. And so we're able to provide financial navigation to get them to our other services, so that we can make sure that they don't get evicted, that we get rental assistance to them, energy assistance, address food insecurity, things like that. So I think that's really where we're really excited and happy about the way that we kind of built our system out, and kind of how we looked at those different issues, but then operationalizing it, making sure that we wrapped around those supportive services to help
And then
them.
do you want to, sorry, just mention briefly the work you're doing on the legislative side of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we talk about policy, we're currently working on a UDAP. We're in draft number 2 or 3. It's been a heavy lift because we started this right before COVID, and then during COVID, we had to kind of put that on pause a bit because we were addressing some critical immediate issues and needs. But now we're back working on the UDAP to really close those gaps both at the state level and at this with municipal regulation, and then also just making sure that we're addressing preemption. So that's the other thing, is making sure that everybody's on the same page. So, but yeah, we're super excited about that as well. We have some really good a task force working on the UDAP policy and some other types of wage theft policies that are kind of add-ons to our UDAP.
And I'll just clarify for the audience that for those that don't know, UDAP is a unfair and deceptive and abusive trade practices type law. So it gives the power to local, or in this case, local government, to sort of address general unfair and deceptive practices activities. And so, Karen, do you want to share a little bit about the couple of things that you guys have been working on, the issues that bubbled up that you then sort of targeted for some strategy?
Well, we've worked on a number of issues, but let me give 2 examples because they sort of flowed out in a very different way. One of the issues that people raised in our initial roundtables was tax preparation services. And in New Mexico, those folks are largely unregulated. So we created a working group and got further input. And began and drafted an ordinance that would be primarily a disclosure ordinance to start with, and creating consumer rights. We ultimately, that was presented to our city council and passed and became effective in February of this year. It has some very strong affirmative requirements around fee disclosures, accountability, the information that has to be provided to consumers when they go to a tax preparation service provider. It's very broad in that it covers both the enrolled agents as well as just the sort of tax professionals who provide these services. We intend we understand there's going to be some pickup time in terms of getting people aware and in compliance. And so we're planning an effective way of then increasing its visibility. We sent out a letter to every single tax service preparer in the city, advising them of their new obligations. They have to file a compliance by the end of the year, and then we'll start the oversight and enforcement process after we've given them some time to come into compliance and understand their obligations. That approach is very different than what we did with evictions. Evictions was not, housing is on our list of priorities. But evictions, in terms of tenant relations, was not really considered initially until COVID hit. And then we got input from people in the community that says, why are mortgages considered consumer financial protection, but not leases? And our interpretation had been, well, there's a separate law, et cetera, et cetera. And we said, you're right, we're wrong. We need to change that. And so the CFPI, our Consumer Financial Protection Initiative, got very involved in issues around eviction prevention, tenant rights, rental assistance. And that involvement was very different than the other work we had done. We started participating in coalition with the advocacy groups, the Coalition to End Homelessness, the groups that do eviction prevention issues that at a community basis. We reached out and started participating with our Access to Justice Commission that was also looking at this issue. We worked to create a cross-department ongoing collaboration at the city level between our Office of Equity and Inclusion, our CFPI, and our Family and Community Services that administers the rental assistance. We've worked to, in collaboration with our Mortgage Finance Authority, with the state-based rental assistance. We've done a lot of outreach. We've done trainings for people who are providing services to families who then find themselves in an eviction situation. We went to our local court to encourage them to create a mediation program at our county level, which they did. Unfortunately, it has not been as effective for a lot of different factors, some of which have to do with money. But we saw this, we took this on as a very broad-based emergency issue and tried to look at all the various ways that it impacted on the community and to become a resource for all those different entities. And it really resulted in a lot of people understanding the link to consumer financial protection that they had not understood before, and why when you're providing city services for rental assistance, you need to understand what the court system is and how it works. That became evident when we talked to the state-based rental assistance program about how the court system works. And they hadn't even thought about that in terms of timing, in terms of providing information to the courts about pending cases that are waiting to be processed in the rental assistance program, et cetera. And the interplay between the time that you have to go to the hearing and the time it takes, which is much longer, to get rental assistance approved and paid. So all of those pieces, we've taken a very visible leadership role on pushing those issues and the relationship between those systems to try and get people to see that. And it's been, it's been very effective. I think it's had an impact on a lot of what's happened in New Mexico and what is happening. We're still struggling with that, as are most cities and states. But we've raised the visibility, and the last thing we did was work as, I served as an expert for state legislation that would have modernized our housing law, which unfortunately failed, but we provided that expertise upon request from the sponsors.
Thank you, Karen. And what I like about what both you and Jay kind of talked about is it really highlights the role that the city can play in taking a leadership role in translating what residents and community members are seeing on the ground into some, effective action. Obviously, we know how government works. It's a mix of successes and failures and barriers and things moving in fits and starts. But it's a really great example. And Munir, I just want to lastly with you, you're obviously a little bit, you're only 9 months into this, and so kind of just maybe share a couple of things about things that you're working on or focused on as you're moving forward into the future as we wrap up.
Yeah, so in the city of St. Paul, we're really focused on actually partnering with our immigrant and refugee program, which is housed out of actually our city attorney's office. What we're moving forward with is a digital fraud sort of awareness campaign around notarial fraud, so around fraudulent sort of immigration services. And it will be a multilingual campaign. Spanish, Hmong, and Somali will be the three languages that we'll be doing that campaign in. And we're actually also partnering with regional partners. So the city of Minneapolis also has a immigrant and refugee program, some legal aid, service providers, that sort of thing. And we know that, the Twin Cities is the Twin Cities, right? There's two big cities, sitting at the center. And what happens here also happens there. And so we need to make sure that really this education and awareness, needs to happen around what is sort of, where are the federal policies at particularly, and then what would fraudulent, types of immigration services look like, which would be some of the signs. And then where should you actually go, to get connected to, above board immigration, services, and what's the ramifications if you don't, right? So sort of a broad sort of education, campaign that's rolling out here. And then at the same time, then Edmundo, who's in our city attorney's office running that immigration and refugee program, is working on some of the enforcement considerations. What's the complaint? How do you field the complaints? And then what does enforcement actually look like? And who are we partnering with versus what's just our city attorney's office doing? So as you said, we're in the early emerging stages of this work. And this is sort of our first project to work on. And for folks who are interested to get in this space, I think it is about, staging what you want to do and starting with something concrete and, really looking at how's that a building block, not feeling like you got to have everything, a big office in place and all your, enforcement staff and all that. But what can you start with today? Use as some proof points and really begin, as a building block for this, because what we know is that our communities, need this consumer financial protection, and we need to start to build sort of that energy within, our institutions, and build those proof points in partnership, with community to really make that vision come true.
Yeah, and the other thing I'm excited about, St. Paul, is you have an unfair and deceptive trade practices law on the books already that we just need to dust off, which is
right.
Which is
That's
exciting.
Right. And I'll Jay for that on what's the best way to dust off. So
yeah. Well, thank you all for.
Can I just make a quick comment?
Yeah.
So I know Karen, had mentioned around their housing and eviction, the work around foreclosures and evictions. And even with, I think, your comment around wage theft not being traditionally looked at as consumer financial protection. And I think that that's an important point, is because, I think even through COVID and really listening to the community and what's really happening, it really has maybe expanded what at least the initial definition or what people kind of thought what consumer financial protection looked like. So I think it's super important, because I think it's a testament to the work that we're doing with the community and being very nimble, even as government, to address those issues quickly. Because the same thing, Ron, who's our director of our consumer financial protection unit, is now, overseeing, he's coordinating our citywide evictions work as well. And Alvin in our office also is coordinating on the foreclosure front. But it really has taken us into areas that were, I think, traditionally not looked at as consumer financial protection. But we're able to step up and address it, because it does have ramifications, as Munir said, around stripping away, assets or even barriers to wealth generation for our most vulnerable populations.
That's a great point, Jay. Thank you. And with that, we'll end this great panel discussion, and then we'll leave time for Q&A, which will happen later. Thank you all again for all of this. All right. Welcome back. And let us know if you have questions, follow-up questions for our great panelists. Let's see. Let's see if there's. Am I looking in the right place? Oh, okay. So far, I think apparently you guys did such a great job in your panel and explanation that nobody had any follow-up questions. But hopefully, I do want to reiterate that we have just launched the RFP for a new crop of cities. So if any of your cities who have not gotten involved in consumer protection, but you think really should, please go to cfefund.org and you'll see the opportunity to join this consumer protection family. And one great thing that I love about this is it's a growing family, and that you can always, we love to connect people like new grantees with people like Jay and Munir and Karen and some of our other places to really learn from each other, because this is how we're going to really build a great movement of local consumer protection. Let me just see. And our NCRC person, Maggie, let us know that there'll be a recording of this session will be available for you to see in the future if you want to come back and look at it. Keith asked a question, is that Shelby County, Tennessee? Yes, Shelby County, Tennessee is part of our group, and we are happy to connect you with Molly, who's leading the effort in Shelby County. Okay. Any other last minute questions? Okay. Okay. Well, I think if that's it, we can wrap up. Thank you guys again.
Thanks, Con.
And thanks again, Karen, Munir, Jay, for doing this. We hope and looking forward to seeing what more work that's happening in each of your cities.
Thank you for all the support, and thank you, Munir and Karen.
Thanks to all.
Thank you all.
Great.
All right. Take care.